all right. I'm using my outside voice while we are waiting. I know that we'll be streaming in a shortly to Facebook, but I want to welcome you all while you're here to our Sermon Talkback with the Reverend Dr. Bill Leonard. Always great to have you with us. Yes, thank you. This is our new format. So, great. Thank you. Our new format, we have little cards. This is both because of COVID, but also for the introverts sometimes you don't get to ask a question, but I will come around with the mic afterward if anything, comes up in your mind towards the end of the conversation, and then I'll give you a chance to speak then. So, Dr. Leonard, one of the questions that we've been asked for a couple of weeks in a row now is sort of what do we do now? So we've been talking about pain and suffering and our call to repair the breach. What does that look like for us tangibly as we try to do community with each other?
Oh my, that's a wonderful question. I'm thinking about it this way these days. This really is a time when congregations need to be absolutely to work again to say, who are we and what are we about in the community and what are we about with each other, and rethinking that is so important. But it's become even more urgent, and that is COVID added another dimension to something I've talked about summer after summer with you all, I think, the dramatic rise in the number of people who have disassociated themselves from religious communities. And this only exacerbates and extends that. And so we have to say that the day in which people move to a community and at least fairly early in the system found a, quote, church home, that ain't here. So when you talk about what to do, each congregation's needs, it seems to me, to try to decide what can we do that's manageable for us. Are there 5 ministries? Are there 6? Is there one that by which we can say to the community in which we live, we are here for you, and we can't expect people come to us anymore. We're going to have to go to them. That is to make our presence known. And your LGBTQ gathering tonight is an illustration to me of one way in which you focus on particular groups with particular issues, needs, presence, and find ways to reach out to them and see where that goes. And from that may lead to other kinds of things. And you all have been doing this for a long time, but the pressure really is how to regain, and I don't mean this in a kind of business model, but how to regain presence in a community, and here's the old Baptist word, and witness to a community. And deciding that, one other quick thing, part of what we all have to realize is we're also going to have to do Christian education. I'm retired at Wake Forest, but this semester and last semester I taught the required intro course to church history, which I began teaching shortly after the Magi came to Bethlehem. And it was all online, but and I had 25 wonderful students both semesters, but one of the things I learned from them is how many of them they may have grown up in church, but they grew up at a time when across the denominational spectrum, Christian education was on the ropes. Or if there was a Christian education program, they were part of families whose attendance was regular but not constant. So that they, in spite of the fact that it was an all-day Saturday course, 9 to 3, which would kill the history for anyone, they got involved because they knew so little about the history of the Christian church and why we do what we do as Christians, not just how we have church, but what the things that they are going to be expected to do really mean because they didn't grow up in that context. That's a quick survey, but those are the kinds of things to decide about. You can't do everything, but deciding what you can do and what in your particular situation needs to be done seems to me important.
Thank you for that. Deciding and discerning what we can do. That's important. We have a question here from someone. They say, you said God cared about how people treat each other. Does the Bible say anywhere that individual rights are important or that personal responsibility is the key to bringing about God's kingdom on earth?
Yes. The part of the church's task in calling, rather, and this goes back to the education issue, I'll use the Bible language, you have to make disciples, and that doesn't mean compel, it doesn't mean force, it means draw into, in Christ, a community that is in Christ. But the duty of the church is then, the calling of the church is to make disciples. And the Bible is clear on that. And that's that mustard seed thing. That takes forever. And all of us can sit here and think about people who at points in our journeys left just a little bit of the gospel with us. Or they thought that was a little bit of the gospel, but something took in us. And it changed us dramatically. And Frederick Buechner has that line about he went to hear George Buttrick preach on a Sunday, and George had a line that wasn't even in the manuscript about Christ refusing the crown and wanting a kingdom that involved this, and this, and great laughter. And he got a copy of the manuscript, and it wasn't even in there. It was a throwaway line that Buttrick had used. And Buechner says that line, that word, and great laughter caught me. And he dates what he would call, I think, his conversion to that moment when one piece, one little mustard seed brought together things that had been out there. And that, when you talk about responsibility and the like, that's where discipleship goes. And a quick little commercial here. This afternoon at 5, I'm going to be with 4 other colleagues, male, female, black, white, on a podcast that the Baptist News Global is sponsoring to talk about the debacle in the Southern Baptist Convention. It's been in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, my Lord, and it's probably in the Bible too. And I'm saying all that to say part of I think one of the failures of evangelicalism right now is it made religious experience a transaction, not a heartwarming transformation. And when the Southern Baptists look at their declines, and they're just the case study now, we're all like this, and that's where the transformation begins, and then the educational process about what that means, this is getting at your question finally, takes place. And that's a churchly calling as well as the religious experience calling as well.
Wow, thank you for that. And speaking of evangelicalism, which we know it's a broad group of people, but this person has a question about how we repair the breach across lines of difference. So they say, I have had a hard time understanding the position of many evangelicals towards the other, that's in quotation, in our society. How do we work to repair the breach with these churches who see the call of the gospel so differently from us? And you just mentioned this transactional piece.
I just touched on that, and I was hoping for a question along these lines. There are some theological divisions in the whole history of the church that have been impossible to connect, to break down, to unite. And that's there almost from the beginning. But there have been times when churches, even of differing opinions, have worked together on the kinds of things I was talking about this morning. And this may not be a favorite illustration for some of you, but one of the classic illustrations in this country was the temperance movement. Evangelicals and what we used to call mainline, old line, dead line, clothesline folks, they came together. The social gospel people came together to fight temperance because it was tearing up families. And fathers would get drunk, it was that kind of society, spend the money, and the children would starve. And they had to take some responsibility, at least to the root of that, to one element of those problems. So the social gospel came out. The evangelicals said that they couldn't find anything in the Bible that condemned, too much drink was condemned in the Bible, but not completely. And so they were a little disappointed in the Holy Bible over that. So they said the Bible is the heart is, the body is the vessel of the Holy Spirit, and you shouldn't taint it with improper spirits. And so they came together. I think both were concerned about both of those issues. I don't mean to say they were, but that was one place in which they came together to deal with a social problem that was just destroying families, particularly in the tenements of the cities. So I think there are places where we can find ways to work together with folks whose theology, if we'll let down the theology enough to get at the issues, and then we can take that up in the talkbacks of our mutual communities and across the lines. But we've got to now, and here's another reason I keep going back to this. The evangelicals are declining numerically as well, and not as fast perhaps as others, but they promised they never would because of their particular approach. So now we're going to need each other as the nons or the nuns. Now 1 out of 5 Americans increase, and again, not to make the churches big, but to make the gospel work with people that don't have it. And I said this in something I wrote recently, and it sounds audacious, but it's not the hubris of it. America needs what the church has to offer. And the things like we talked about today, that Isaiah 58 is timeless. Jesus picks it up in Luke 4 with the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, etc. That's a place where I think we find ourselves together because those issues, I mean, a repairer of the streets. That's now.
Yeah. A question says, is part of the breach due to the fact that leaders do not have a positive winning solution, so they result to petty negative attacking?
I'll just say yes and go on to the next question. One of the things, and again, I keep coming back to this. There were communities of faith across the board that thought this would never happen. And we built large sanctuaries to worship as if the gospel stock market was always going to increase. And that denominations were always going to be the primary way of organizing religious life and identity in the country. And then it took a turn. So I think, and now I'll give you, you'll be glad you came and stayed because I'll give you a little bit of hope at the end. And I really mean this. I have been in awe of a younger generation. I'll point at Mia here as a case study. Of a younger generation of ministers, male and female, multiracial, and what they're doing in their churches. And the reason I say that is this generation going into ministry knows that the old networks don't work. They never worked in most denominations for women, and still don't in some. But the breakdown of those denominational systems has happened as this generation and the previous one, I think, depending on how you count it, were coming of age. But they have gone into churches and often learning on site, have brought a leadership, hence the question, that I find just, and I mean this honestly, I'm just in awe of them. And I could run a list of names for you today across the country. I'm just astounded by it. And that gives me great hope, because maybe unlike the leaders of my generation who thought this was always going to be the way it was, they know it's not, and so they're working with what they have. And they are working where they are. And they are finding ways to energize congregations, sometimes to help them wind down. But even out of that, I didn't want to get away today without telling you, Brian Cole is the Episcopal Bishop of East Tennessee. He studied with me at the Baptist Seminary in Louisville and worked with us in an Appalachian program. And like every other friend of mine, Baptist preacher friend of mine, he became an Episcopalian. And I'm exaggerating slightly. But Brian told me that in the Diocese of East Tennessee, he closed down his first church last month. But they got $750,000 for the property. And he said, it's finally dawned on me, irony of ironies, that $750,000 from that church that's gone may help save 5 or 6 churches that would have gone under without that cash to help them. So even out of the death of one congregation, others may be able to live and get through this because of that. And this is the generation that's having to negotiate those realities. And they also have a sense of the gospel that's much less institutional than I came of age with. And that makes them risky, I think. Crazy too sometimes. I said that just because you laughed, Leah. But risky. And again, I could run the names of people who are doing it right now, and that's the hope.
Thank you for that. We have a church partner in the Alliance, St. Charles Baptist, which is in New Orleans, who are having to make difficult decisions about, do we keep our building? Do we transition into a 501c3 nonprofit and do more outreach instead of services on Sundays? So a lot of churches are making those difficult decisions right now.
A quick other illustration, Binkley Memorial Church in Chapel Hill, they were making, and I don't think they'd mind my telling this, $80,000 a year from the rental of groups that use their building. COVID shut that down, so they had to narrow their budget with because they couldn't make up the $80,000. Now that will come back, but that's the kind of entrepreneurial effort that churches are going to have to do to help them not just stay afloat, but help their communities.
Yes. So, reflecting on helping the community, in the heyday, churches had a lot of resources to meet the needs that inequity made.
Yes.
And so this person's question says, I thought with great interest about your comment that the church and its physical being, building, ground, sanctuary, are so important in today's world, especially since COVID exposed so many inequities in our society, like healthcare, employment, and monetary opportunities. What is the church's role now in its decline or something? What is the church's role now in repairing the breach and merging or meeting the needs that these inequities have provided?
Well, and you said, I think, an important word just now about St. Charles Avenue. Partnerships are just essential. And church mergers. One way churches may stay alive, and that's happened for always in this country, that churches merge and take the building that has the greatest resources that's available. So I think, and I'll say, and I don't know the details, but I know there were people who were concerned about your health center as when it was first built, but it's an illustration to me that it may not be an entry level for people to come to this church, but it is a community response that is meeting a need, and people know where you are because of that. And that's one option. And you all happen to have folks who had resources to help you do that. But that's what I mean by other congregations choosing ways to do that. Also, congregations in the smaller level sharing ministers. That's also, the Methodist Circuit Riders were representative of that, but we're kind of coming back to that. I was mentioning to Mia, I think, this morning coming in about preaching at an African-American church down in the country from Greensboro, and the pastor is a wonderful entrepreneur, and he got grant money to build a community center on the church property that helps bring people from that rural area together. And like you did it early on, probably don't have to now, but that's a Wi-Fi shortage area, so they provide computer Wi-Fi for folks. I preached for them on the telephone. It's the first time I've ever held a receiver up to my ear and preached the gospel, which is probably why I preached too long this morning. And I told him afterwards that it reminded me of one of my grandmother's songs. I love to talk to Jesus on the royal telephone. Only some of us of an age will know that. So I was on the royal telephone that Sunday. But they found ways to do that. And that's the entrepreneurial issue. A number of churches I know, and you probably do too, are writing grants that are available to churches in particular community connections to use their facilities or their leadership or whatever, their volunteers. And that's another kind of issue as well. So I hope that gets a bit at that question.
Thank you. We have one question here. I don't know if you can predict the future, but this person says, okay, be honest. Where will we be next year this time?
Where will
we be next year this time?
I think we're still in this moment, this cultural, historical moment where reaching out to people who have either pulled out of religion or who've never been involved, and increasingly we're at that generational stage where in churches that generation that grandmothers used to bring to church got lost in many congregations. And so I think we're going to have to be really smart and really intentional about this is the moment, and we may not have others if we lose it. That's my being honest, the question was asking. And so I said, we're going to have to be tireless and exhausted in this endeavor. But I still believe, and I just saw that as the students in my class this semester came into touch with people in the history of the church that they hadn't known about, and they were overwhelmed by them, particularly the non-white male theologians. There's that wonderful energy and opportunity, but there are fewer of us. And so that means the responsibility is on fewer of us as well.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. This one says, how can we get the blue and red individuals, I'm assuming they're speaking politically, in this congregation to have a way to sit down and talk in order to heal that breach?
You know, I'm just, there's a text in here. This text this morning said, don't hide from your kin. Did you all hear that? Mm-hmm. And I started to say in the middle of the sermon, that that means I can't go back to Texas no more. But that would be joking. But here's what I think. One way to start is to start talking about the things you know you have to do together. If you get on red state, blue state, if you do that, you'll never get anywhere. But where are the things? There are people. What do you do about people in Charlotte, young people who are hooked with the opioid issue? I mean, look at those issues, and that's the infrastructure that I'm talking about. And decide on one thing you can talk about that you know you have to work together. And before you get to how you voted, talk about what needs to be done and what you can do together, whatever your theology or your politics. And maybe just take an issue at a time and talk about those issues that are affecting everybody. Red states, blue states, opioid crisis is there. What about X, Y, and Z? Just pick those and start finding ways to start the discussion. And then maybe you can slip over into something that starts that conversation. We just have to hope.
Yes, thank you for that. I have one more question here, and then I'll open it up and meet you where you are if you want to make a comment, a quick comment, or a question. This person says, your sermons are always excellent. And then they want to know, they say something about your daughter lighting up the room, and how is she?
Oh, thank you. Judy has a notebook, a little notebook I brought today, and if any of y'all want to write her a note, she said to me before I left, get Joe and Judy to write me a note. So I've done that. Our daughter is a person with special needs. She turned 46 in April, and we've had to quarantine her desperately, for the whole time. And before the shots and all, she and I would drive through McDonald's. She is addicted to mocha frappes, I'm sad to say. And the people at 3 McDonald's know us, even with the mask. And some of the women will say, where's my baby? When we drive, if she's not with me. Mm-hmm. She went to Costco with me recently after we got shots. And after your special needs daughter has not been anywhere for a year and a half, please don't take her to Costco to start. Just let me get that on the table. She came with me 2 years ago on the jazz worship service, but I just don't know if she's up to it, because it would be such a major step for her. And Candace, my wonderful spouse, and I were talking about it, the trip down and et cetera, et cetera. And then when I was here 2 years ago, we went to Roosters after, and she wants to get to Roosters before she gets to Jesus. So I don't know if she's up to taking all of that involved, and I'm doubtful, but we'll talk about it. She would love to be here, and I'd love to have her. So we'll see. We'll see.
Thank you. I love hearing
Thank you so much for asking.
Yes. Are there any short comments, questions? I'm going to come to you.
Talking about working with people who are different from us, I remember how we came together with North Carolina Baptist men in Tarboro and Princeville. for disaster relief after Hurricane Floyd. North Carolina Baptist men were running the show, and what they were believing and what I was believing didn't match, but we put on the hazmat suits and we shoveled out that mess that came up to people's attics, and we did it together.
Yes. I think that's an excellent illustration, again, and that was something that happened, that wasn't long-term, that was a short-term issue, and plugging into that together is really excellent. And I think there are many people in both communities, I think, red and blue, and I mean that theologically as well as politically, that are saying, we got to stop this. This is a dead-end street for the country, not to mention the gospel.
Bill, so many of issues that we face in society can be dealt with more effectively through government than through our small church resources. Yet there's this line that we have, a separation of church and state. How far can we go as a church before we cross that line of separation of church and state, of affecting some of our political issues that are so underfunded today?
That's a great question, and thank you for calling me back to being a Baptist. Several things. I think there are ways in which let me start with the negative. One of the things that concerns me about certain Baptist groups, I'll just speak of our family, is that as cultural privilege, Protestant cultural privilege has diminished, some groups have gone to the government to try to rescue them or to restore lost cultural privilege, and it's a disaster. And so that's not what we have to do. But if there are monies that we collectively, not just the church doing, but can do, as we were saying, with other community groups to benefit the community outside the church, or to utilize the church property for that kind of communal ministry, whether we call it that. I think we can talk about that, but we always have to be careful because the government consistently, from always, from the medieval period, from Constantine, they want a pound of flesh if you're not careful, and you end up being in worse shape than you were when you thought it would help you. And that's the guard that particularly Baptists have to look to. And one of the things that saddens me, and not to be judgmental, but just to be ministerial, show ministerial sadness, is the churches that think that the government can do what they couldn't do in the culture, do for them, and that's always a danger. And there need to be people, you represent it right now, who hold up that banner to remind us. And but I find many of this younger generation knowing how to do that and respond accordingly. I find that, and trying to be careful about it. Yeah. Good.
Is there one final question or comment that you want to make to wrap us up today? Anybody? Well, all right then. Dr. Leonard, thank you so much. Anything you want to share with us before we wrap today? And we'll have you back next week, so, you know.
Good. I know. Just to thank you as always for I hope you can tell, being with you and the kinds of dialogue we have and the kind of worship we celebrate energizes me. And again, you all, to me, coming in as an outsider, you all represent that. And that's what people in this community need to know about. you have a gospel for the people who know nothing about Jesus, and the people who think they know everything about Jesus. And you've always done that so well, and that's what always energizes me. So blessings to you. Peace.